Joining me now from New Orleans is the Reverend Raymond Brown. He is a pastor and civil rights activist. With me here in Washington is Jeanne Meserve. She is a former CNN correspondent and reported from New Orleans during the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. Also with us from Orlando is Richard Fowler. He is a talk radio show host. And from New Orleans, we are also joined by Gary Rivlin. He is a journalist and author of the book Katrina After the Flood. Welcome to all of you to the show. Reverend Brown, let me start with you. Let's start by going back 10 years. Remind us of what Hurricane Katrina did to New Orleans and the Gulf Coast region.
Yes, sir. Katrina, as I can remember, Katrina must have landed around about 6 or 6:30 that evening when the wind started blowing hard and the rain started coming down real hard. We just felt in our gut that something really bad was about to happen. So on that 29th date of August, we was like, wow, what's getting ready to happen to New Orleans? And so I would say about 11 or 12 o'clock that night when the storm came into the city, I have never seen destruction of such a magnitude in my life. I was actually on a platform at my work, Orleans Parish Prison, looking out the window at the wind and how the infrastructure just was crumbling around us. 130 miles an hour wind slashing the city. So you can imagine what the horrifying. And then I thought about my family trapped in those little low-lying areas like the Ninth Ward, and I was like, wow. This is catastrophic. I just started crying uncontrollably, looking at the devastation. I mean, I choke up right now, because I just feel that, Katrina was a horrible storm. And the bad part about it, when we thought that the storm was over, we saw the water continue to rise. That's the problem. We say, wait a minute, this storm didn't destroy us. Then we realized that the water was rising and rising. That's when we began to hear reports that people was drowning and that homes was being flooded with water and family was being evacuated. It just turned into a total chaos. Total chaos on the 29th was a total chaos. I mean,
right,
unimaginable. Go ahead, sir. I'm sorry.
That's fine. Jeanne, you were there at the time. You were a CNN correspondent. The initial reporting on Hurricane Katrina suggested that New Orleans had been spared the worst. We were told it was further down the coast, etc. But then you started reporting on CNN, and the United States and the world began to see the real devastation that this hurricane had been causing. What did you see at the time? What was it like?
Well, I was amongst those who thought that New Orleans had dodged a bullet. I was downtown. There was some flooding, some windows out. We'd seen the roof come off the Superdome, but things appeared okay. But then wet people were being brought into the Superdome, and our producer down there said, something's going on. We went down, met up with a member of the city council who took us out to where the flooding was just unbelievable to us. It was as far as the eyes could see, up to the eaves of the houses. We could see people trying to bust through their roofs to get out to the light and the air. Some people had made their way to some railroad tracks, slightly higher elevation. They were able to walk along there in water that was about waist deep, but pushing everything they owned. We went on the air late that afternoon, early in the evening, by phone, telling people what was happening because we didn't have the capability at that point to put up pictures. But I will say that the people back in Atlanta and back in New York at my network didn't seem to fully understand what we were describing to them. It wasn't until later in the evening that Aaron Brown, who was anchoring the 10 o'clock show on CNN, really heard what I was saying and did an extended interview, and that, I'm told, is what woke up the rest of the world.
Right, so the full enormity of what was happening was not, let's say, reported until much later.
No. We saw one local news reporter in the area when we got there. She'd been out on a rescue boat and had come in, but apparently her station had been knocked off the air. We had a network So we were the only ones trying to raise the alarm out there by television. I will say that FEMA had somebody on the ground there who had been hearing reports since the morning.
That's the Federal Emergency Agency.
Federal Emergency Management Agency, who'd heard reports that the levees had been breached. He went up in the air in a Coast Guard helicopter at about 6 in the afternoon. He was trying to send the word up through his channels. I was on the air. We both, I know because we've talked, were desperate to try and make the federal government and others aware of what was happening, but they weren't listening to either one of us.
Wow.
Richard, the poor and particularly African Americans seem to bear the brunt of this tragedy. What was your reaction as you watched this unfold on television?
I can remember Katrina almost like I remember 9/11. I think they're parallel, to be honest with you, Anand. I remember I was in my college dormitory at the time, a lot younger, and sort of watching it all play out and thinking to myself, how could this happen in the United States of America? What Katrina told us, beyond just being, Mother Nature reacting, this was a failure of a government to get the job done, right, on all levels. Right? FEMA should have been there a lot quicker, and I think the reporter clearly talks about that, the idea that we were trying to raise the alarm, right? Everybody had known that these levees were not structurally sound. The Army Corps of Engineers had said, hey, listen, there's a problem here, but we did not make the right investments. Now, that is up for question, right? And I think if you tie it into where we are today as a nation, right, we're talking about this Black Lives Matter. This is sort of a foreshadowing, right? If you talk from Katrina to where we are today, did Black Lives Matter to the administration at that point in time? Did they make the right investments to make sure those levees didn't break? These are the questions we should be asking ourselves and figuring out how we make sure this never happens again in America.
Gary, if we go back to that time, the United States and the world was shocked at what was happening in a major American city. What went wrong? What went so badly wrong?
Yeah, I mean, some of it was ideology. The Bush administration came in and slashed FEMA, demoted it from cabinet-level position to in Homeland Security. There was actually an exercise a year before, imagining a Category 3 slow-moving storm hitting New Orleans, and they found that it would have catastrophic flooding. Katrina was a slow-moving Category 3 storm. They had a dry run. They understood that they needed buses. They needed to have truckloads of food and water there. They just didn't do it. I mean, it was interesting that CNN had more information than the White House, or actually CNN and the White House had the same information. It just, inside FEMA headquarters, they didn't believe it. Their own FEMA man, as was pointed out, was in the air saying 75% of the city is covered with water. That was Monday night. It wasn't until late Tuesday that FEMA really recognized, and that whole week they were a day or two behind. You had 25,000 people at the Superdome. They were there for 5 days till Friday morning. Finally, the buses showed up. Convention Center, 20,000 people, was 6 days before the buses showed up. It was a complete failure of the government. I would actually put most of the blame at the federal government.
Isn't that amazing, Jeanne, that you were the source for the federal government?
Not completely. I think that often journalists do act as the early alarm system, and that's why if you walk into any operations center, there's usually a bank of television monitors on the air. I would argue that today it would be different because of social media. Social media was not in widespread use at the time. If it were, there still was some limited cell service when I got out to the flooding. People would have been sending photos on Instagram. They would have been tweeting. And you know what? The Federal Emergency Management Agency now monitors social media to look for those things, and so does the Red Cross. So there would be a much earlier alarm system. But also, just to build on those comments of Gary Rivlin, it was a failure of government at the federal level, but I would argue there also were failures at the local and state level as well.
Reverend Brown, we've just heard President Obama talk about this. He was in New Orleans on Thursday. Let's take a listen to what he said.
And this was something that was supposed to never happen here, maybe someplace else, but not here, not in America. And we came to realize that what started out as a natural disaster became a man-made disaster, a failure of government to look out for its own citizens. And the storm laid bare a deeper tragedy that had been brewing for decades, because we came to understand that New Orleans, like so many cities and communities across the country, had for too long been plagued by structural inequalities that left too many people, especially poor people, especially people of color, without good jobs or affordable health care or decent housing Too many kids grew up surrounded by violent crime, cycling through substandard schools where few had a shot to break out of poverty. And so, like a body weakened already, undernourished already, when the storm hit, there was no resources to fall back on.
So there you have it there, Reverend Brown. You know,
Well,
President Obama saying it all
yes.
in that short excerpt.
Right. I was considered one of those refugees that the reporter was talking about. I was trapped in a building. I was without food. I was treated less than a human being. I was called a refugee, me and my family and my friends, and we just felt that America had turned their backs on us, and we, to this day, have not really recovered from that storm. We, in our city, as you know, in New Orleans, we have a tremendous high unemployment rate. The murder rate is just out of control. I think we are ranking per capita #1 in the nation in murder and in crime. So the Katrina, we have not recovered basically from Katrina, not yet. So while the president, and all due respect to what he said, all the billions of dollars, 180 billion that was spent during Katrina, the African-American community are still in poverty. We still are oppressed. So I'm saying to the world that is listening, please understand that just because they make statements like, oh, you know, the New Orleans have come back and we are doing great, in essence, on the outside, the French Quarter looked pretty good. Pretty good. Everybody getting along, but in the inner city, you still have that poverty, that crime wave, that dysfunctional family. So we still need help here in the city. Katrina devastated us. It's like adding insult to injury. So what we are saying is that the people that are listening on a national, international level, we need you to come in and help us recover.
Right.
We haven't recovered yet.